Rome exhales in the damp chill of a December night. The kind where torchlight glistens off marble as if the city itself is sweating. Somewhere far above the din of clattering carts and barking street vendors, the imperial palace looms, a hulk of stone and shadow, and in it, a man sits on a gilded chair as if it were a throne given to him by the gods themselves. That man is Commodus, and in this moment, he believes the world bends toward his will. You probably won't sleep soundly after this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The streets of Rome are always alive, but lately, they've been humming with a different kind of energy, the kind that comes when people are too afraid to speak plainly. You can hear it in the markets, when merchants lower their voices halfway through a sentence. You can sense it when senators pass one another in the forum, glancing over their shoulders before leaning in close. It is the sound of a city under the weight of its ruler's eccentricities. Commodus isn't like the emperors before him. He doesn't pace the palace halls worrying over tax reforms or border security. No, his eyes glitter when he talks about the arena, about the sand, about the roar of the crowd. He believes himself a reincarnation of Hercules, muscles oiled and gleaming, club in hand. And when you rule Rome, that's not just a personal hobby, it's a declaration that every other man, whether senator or slave, exists to applaud your performance. Some historians still argue whether Commodus' obsession with the games was harmless vanity or a dangerous neglect of his duties. But to the men and women who lived under his reign, it didn't much matter. The treasury bled gold to fund his spectacles. The Senate sat powerless, forced to nod along as their emperor dressed in lion skins and demanded to be worshipped. And outside the palace, the city's underbelly thrived in the shadows. Gambling rings exploded, gladiators became celebrities. Bread was scarce in poorer districts because the grain ships were delayed. Yet the imperial games always had fresh loaves to toss into the stands. In the cramped taverns along the Tiber, people muttered comparisons between Commodus and Nero, each one punctuated with a nervous laugh. At least Nero played the lyre. One man might say, swilling wine. This one wants to bash your head in with a club. Of course, even joking about the emperor could earn you a quiet disappearance. Still, whispers travel faster than any imperial decree. They slip through cracks in the marble, down servants' corridors, through bathhouses and bakeries, and lately, those whispers are starting to collect around one question. What happens when the man at the top stops playing emperor and starts playing God? Because somewhere, in one of those shadowed corners of the city, there are people who believe they already know the answer. By the winter of 192 AD, the imperial court has settled into an uneasy rhythm, a kind of tense ballet where every senator, every general, every servant knows exactly how to move when Commodus enters a room. Heads bow a little lower. Jokes die halfway through a breath. The air itself thickens. The palace walls keep secrets well, but they also amplify absurdities. When Commodus decides that Rome should be renamed Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, there's no one in the marble corridors brave enough to call it madness out loud. Statues of him as Hercules sprout in the gardens. His likeness appears on coins, in temples, on amphitheater banners. Even the calendar is altered. Months are renamed in his honor. The man isn't just rewriting Rome's present, he's chiseling himself into eternity. But while the emperor plays God, the machinery of power grinds in the shadows. The Senate smolders with resentment, its members stripped of influence and humiliated before the mob. The Praetorian Guard, that elite wall of steel meant to protect the emperor, has grown restless. Under its prefect, Quintus Aemilius Latus, the guard is beginning to question whether the coin they earn is worth the humiliation they endure at Commodus' whim. And then there's Marcia. Officially, she is one of Commodus' favored concubines. Unofficially, she is one of the most perceptive women in Rome. A master at listening without seeming to listen. Marcia understands the emperor better than most. She knows his moods, his pride, and most importantly, his vulnerabilities. Historians still argue whether her influence was born of genuine affection or quiet ambition. Either way, She has more access to Commodus than nearly anyone alive. And access is the most valuable currency in a palace that thrives on secrets. Outside those gilded halls, the empire creaks under its own weight. Frontier legions grumble about unpaid wages. Grain shipments from Egypt are delayed, causing shortages that spark riots in the Sabura district. Meanwhile, Commodus lavishes gold on extravagant gladiatorial events, sometimes even stepping into the arena himself to battle opponents who mysteriously trip or collapse before his blade. Quirky fact? The emperor once ordered exotic beasts, lions, panthers, even a giraffe, brought into the Colosseum, only to slaughter them with his own javelins from a safely elevated platform. The crowd, of course, was ordered to cheer. It's in this climate of indulgence and quiet fury that the first threads of conspiracy begin to weave together. Latus, Marcia, and Eclectus, the emperor's chamberlain, share whispered conversations that skirt dangerously close to treason. They speak in riddles and half-sentences, careful never to name the thing they're circling. The idea of removing Commodus is both unthinkable and unavoidable. Killing an emperor isn't just a political gamble, it's a sacrilege. An act that will ripple across the empire. But what is more dangerous, committing that act, or allowing him to reign unchecked? Remember those whispers in the taverns along the Tiber? The ones about what happens when a man stops playing emperor and starts playing God. In the palace, that whisper has turned into a thought, and in the minds of three key figures, Latus, Marcia, and Eclectus, it's becoming something far more dangerous. It is late December, and Rome wears winter like a borrowed cloak, ill-fitting. Slightly uncomfortable, but not entirely unwelcome. The Tiber runs sluggish and cold. The sky is the color of dull lead, and the markets hum with the business of the Saturnalia festival. Saturnalia, with its gift-giving, role reversals, and open license for mischief, has always been the empire's week of chaos. But this year, beneath the laughter and clinking goblets, the city carries an undercurrent of apprehension. Inside the palace, Commodus is restless. He has decided that he will not enter the new year as merely an emperor. He will enter it as a gladiator god. Plans are underway for a grand appearance in the Colosseum on the first day of 193 AD. He will fight, or at least perform the illusion of fighting, before the people, proving once and for all that no mortal can match him. His obsession with the arena has become all-consuming, eclipsing affairs of state entirely. For Marcia, Latus, and Eclectus, this fixation is both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because Commodus' attention is elsewhere, leaving them free to meet discreetly. A curse because each public spectacle he stages further erodes the dignity of the imperial office and risks provoking open rebellion. Historians still argue whether the final push toward assassination was born of desperation or opportunity. What they do agree on is that sometime in the final week of December, the three conspirators made their pact. It was not spoken aloud in a formal meeting, that would have been too dangerous. Instead, it formed like frost on a windowpane, slow, silent, unmistakable. The moment crystallized over dinner in Marcia's private chambers. Commodus had retired early, drunk on wine and his own grand plans. Latus arrived first, his praetorian cloak dusted with the damp chill of the night. Eclectus followed, carrying a small wax tablet under his arm. There was no toast, no ceremony. Latus simply said, "If we don't act now, we never will." Eclectus placed the tablet on the table, not a written plan, but a list of the emperor's attendants and their duties. The message was clear: access points, vulnerabilities, routines. And Marcia? She didn't hesitate. She had lived too long in the eye of Commodus' storm to believe it would ever calm. She knew his rages, his whims, the way he could turn affection into violence in the space of a breath. If she played her part well, she could both save her own life and shape the empire's future. The three agreed on one thing: the assassination must be swift, silent, and above suspicion, at least until it was done. A coup in the open would splinter the empire. But a sudden, unexplained death? That could be contained. Here's your quirky detail for the night. Commodus maintained a private room stocked with poisons. Not for political use but for what he called pest control. He claimed it was to deal with vermin in the palace kitchens. Yet everyone knew vermin was a word he occasionally applied to people. The conspirators considered using one of those poisons, poetic justice. In a way, but dismissed it. Too slow, too uncertain. Instead, they settled on a plan that would begin with a poisoned drink, something quick enough to incapacitate, but not so quick as to be obvious, and, if that failed, a physical end by trusted hands. Outside, Saturnalia's laughter drifted over the city, mingling with the faint scent of pine and roasting meats. Inside, in the dim golden light of Marcia's chamber, 3 people crossed an invisible line from fear to action. And as Commodus slept in his private apartments, dreaming perhaps of lion hunts and the roar of the crowd, the first true night of his last week began to slip quietly toward morning. The palace feels different after that night, not outwardly, not in any way a casual observer could describe, but to those attuned to its rhythms. The change is palpable. The air seems thicker, the silences longer, servants step more lightly in the halls. Even the torchlight seems to burn with a more watchful glow. Commodus, however, notices none of it. He is too busy rehearsing his upcoming triumph in the arena. Each morning, he trains in a private colonnade, stripped to the waist, oiled like a statue, muscles glistening as he swings a practice sword. He imagines the roar of the crowd, the chants of his name, the eyes of the empire upon him. He is the center of his own myth, and in that myth, nothing can touch him. Marcia plays her role flawlessly. She brings him wine, listens to his grand plans with an expression that is equal parts admiration and patience. She knows exactly when to laugh, when to sigh, when to gently question without provoking. Latest tightens security at the gates under the pretense of controlling Saturnalia revelers, but really to ensure no unexpected visitors can disrupt the palace's internal theater. Eclectus manages correspondence with careful precision, discarding any letters that might warn the emperor of brewing dissent. Historians still argue whether Commodus was already suspicious by these final days. Some accounts claim he was planning to replace Marcia, Latus, and Eclectus with new favorites, a dangerous prospect for all 3. Others suggest he was blissfully unaware, convinced of his own invincibility. What is certain is that by December 30th, the conspirators had selected the day, the morning of the new year. Here's your quirky fact for tonight. Commodus had planned to march into the arena dressed as the god Hercules, complete with lion skin, wooden club, and a list of nobles he intended to execute as part of the performance. Yes, nothing says holiday spirit like combining a gladiatorial match with a mass political purge. The list had names, many names, and, conveniently, the first 3 were Marcia, Latus, and Eclectus. Marcia saw that list. No one knows exactly how. Perhaps she found it in the emperor's study. Perhaps he boasted of it in a drunken haze, but once she saw it, the plan shifted from an act of political preservation to one of immediate self-defense. The palace on the night before the end is almost unnervingly calm. Outside, the city drinks itself into chaos for the final night of Saturnalia. Inside, Commodus bathes in warm, perfumed water, humming to himself, imagining the next day's spectacle. In the kitchens, Marcia's hand-picked servant prepares a jug of wine, deep red, thick, and laced with something far deadlier than spice. Latus makes his rounds in the guardhouse, speaking to each praetorian posted near the emperor's wing. His words are simple: the emperor will not be disturbed tonight. Eclectus remains at his post near the audience hall, intercepting any last-minute messages. In a way, the whole palace seems to hold its breath. Later, Commodus sits at his private table, Marcia pouring the wine with her usual care. He raises the cup in a casual salute, to himself, most likely, and drinks deeply. The poison begins its slow, invisible work, curling through his veins. But Commodus is strong, and the hours pass without the collapse they expect. His breathing grows heavier, his eyelids lower, but the iron in his body fights back against the treachery. And so, as midnight approaches and the first day of the year creeps closer, the conspirators realize the poison will not be enough. The second part of the plan will have to be carried out. Somewhere down the corridor, a trusted figure waits in the shadows, someone Commodus will not fear until it is far too late. The chosen man stands in the dim light of the emperor's antechamber, leaning against a column as if simply awaiting orders. He is a wrestler, a hulking figure named Narcissus, once admired in the arena for his strength, now serving as Commodus's personal sparring partner. The emperor had trusted him enough to face him unarmed, to let him train beside him, to share the intimacy of sweat and breath in combat practice. And that trust is precisely why Marcia selected him for the final act. Narcissus does not know the exact details of the poison, only that Commodus must not live to see the next sunrise. He is a man of action, not politics. His orders are clear: if the emperor lingers, finish what the cup began. In Commodus's private chamber, the air smells faintly of the oil and wine that still coat his skin. He has moved to his bed but has not yet surrendered to full sleep. His breathing is slow but uneven. The poison has dulled him, but his mind still drifts in half-formed thoughts, perhaps imagining the cheers of tomorrow's games, or the stunned faces of senators as they are dragged into the sand. Historians still argue whether he realized, in those final moments, that something was wrong. Cassius Dio claims he vomited and tried to revive himself with a drink, only to have it knocked away. Herodian says he was too far gone to resist. Either way, the accounts agree on what came next. The curtain parts. Narcissus enters, silent as a shadow for a man his size. There's no ceremony, no speech, no villain's monologue, just the sudden weight of him on the bed. The forearm across the emperor's throat, the crushing pressure that leaves no room for breath. Commodus's hands shoot up, clawing at the man he once trusted. But his strength is no match for Narcissus's trained bulk. Here's the quirky fact of this section. Roman wrestling was not like modern entertainment wrestling. It was brutal, close range, and involved techniques designed to control or disable an opponent in seconds. Narcissus applies them with cold precision. The emperor struggles for a moment longer, his eyes wide, lips parting in a strangled gasp that never fully forms. There's no roar of a crowd here, no applause, only the muffled creak of the bed frame and the pounding of two hearts, one fading, one unyielding. When it is over, Narcissus lets go and steps back. The silence in the chamber is different now, heavier, final. Commodus lies still, his once golden hair damp, his mouth slightly open as though about to speak. Latus arrives first, his eyes sweeping the room in a single, quick assessment. He nods once to Narcissus, not a congratulation, not even thanks, just confirmation that the task is done. Marcia appears moments later, her face unreadable. She looks at the emperor's body for a long time, perhaps thinking of the years she spent in his shadow, or perhaps just calculating what must be done next. Eclectus is already moving, quietly instructing servants to burn certain papers, to prepare messengers, to seal doors. The body will be handled discreetly, the announcement, carefully timed. Outside, the city still celebrates Saturnalia, the drunken cheers carrying faintly through the palace walls. No one out there yet knows that Rome has lost its ruler, and that tomorrow will not bring the spectacle Commodus promised. But something far more dangerous, a power vacuum. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rings in the new year. Inside the emperor's chamber, the three conspirators exchange a look that is not relief, not triumph, just acknowledgement. The game has only just begun. The palace feels like it is holding its breath. Behind the gilded doors and marble corridors, the machinery of imperial transition grinds into motion, slow and deliberate. Commodus's body, still warm not an hour ago, now lies on a couch draped in purple, not for honor, but to hide it from prying eyes. Latus has summoned only those he trusts to carry the corpse. In the torchlight, their shadows stretch unnaturally long across the polished floors, as if even the walls want to distance themselves from what has happened. No priest is called. No mourning rites are spoken, just the muted shuffle of sandals and the careful, almost reverent way they lift him. Outside the chamber, Marcia waits. Her cloak is drawn tight, but her expression is a masterclass in composure. This is the moment she feared most, not the killing, but the keeping of control afterward. She knows Rome can devour itself in hours if there's even a whisper of uncertainty. They move quickly through the private halls, avoiding the main corridors where servants might gossip. At one point, a drunken singer from the Saturnalia feast stumbles into view, clutching a lyre. Latus freezes, hand near his dagger. Marcia, without breaking stride, smiles sweetly at the man and says the emperor is sleeping off too much wine. The singer laughs, bows, and vanishes down the hall. Historians still argue whether Commodus's body was taken directly to the baths or to a quieter wing of the palace first. Cassius Dio claims it was hidden until dawn to prevent panic. Others insist it was prepared for cremation immediately. The truth may lie somewhere between, shifting with each retelling. Here's the lesser-known detail. In Roman political murders, the death itself was rarely the most dangerous part, it was the hours after, when loyalty had to be secured before rivals could seize the narrative. That's why Eclectus, the Chamberlain, moves like a man in a race only he understands. He sends coded messages to trusted officials, arranging for the Senate to convene at first light. In a smaller courtyard, the body is set down. The night air is cool, carrying the faint scent of pine from nearby gardens. Narcissus stands apart, arms crossed. He's not part of what comes next, his role is over. He watches as a heavy cloth is pulled over Commodus's face, the face that once smiled at him during training matches. The face that now will never see another sunrise. Careful, Marcia murmurs, though whether she means the handling of the body or the handling of the empire. No one is quite sure. By the time the first hint of dawn touches the rooftops of Rome, the palace is transformed into a theater of calm efficiency. Servants are ordered to continue festival duties as though nothing has happened. Guards are posted at key entrances, not to protect the emperor, but to control the flow of news. And then, the most delicate moment, the announcement. Eclectus knows it must be done in such a way that it doesn't invite chaos. He instructs a herald to say that the emperor died peacefully in his sleep, claimed by the gods at the height of the festival. The words are designed to soothe, to present the image of a natural, even dignified end. Still, in the back rooms of the Curia, senators exchange glances heavy with meaning. Some hide smiles, others mask panic. Commodus had made enemies of many, but the speed of his demise is suspicious, even to those who welcome it. From the balcony of her private chamber, Marcia watches the city stir. The streets below are still decorated for Saturnalia, streamers swaying gently in the breeze. She wonders how many of those revelers will even notice the change right away. Rome, after all, has always had more emperors than it knows what to do with. Somewhere, a raven lands on the palace wall, its black eyes glinting in the rising sun. In another city, that might be seen as an omen. In Rome, it's just another bird, but still, it lingers. The Senate chamber is colder than usual that morning, though perhaps that is only the mood. Columns loom like silent judges, their marble veins catching the faint winter light. The air smells faintly of damp wool cloaks and oil lamps. Outside, the city is just waking. Inside, the political heart of Rome is already racing. Latus enters first, flanked by a small guard, carrying himself with a quiet authority. He is not here to speak unless necessary. His presence alone is a reminder that the Praetorian Guard has chosen its side. Behind him comes Eclectus, the Chamberlain, and a handful of senators who were quietly warned to arrive early. When the news is delivered, the Emperor Commodus has been taken by the gods. The chamber ripples like a pond disturbed by a stone. Some heads bow in feigned reverence, others lift sharply, eyes narrowing, calculating new opportunities. Commodus was, after all, not the most beloved ruler. The Senate had endured his whims, his arena performances, and his disregard for their authority for far too long. One senator mutters, just loud enough for his neighbor to hear, "The gods, or someone's hands?" It is not answered, but the thought hangs heavy in the air. Historians still argue whether this day was one of relief or apprehension for the Senate. The truth may be both. Eclectus wastes no time. He names Pertinax, respected, seasoned, and conveniently nearby, as the next emperor. The choice is not universally popular, but it is practical. Pertinax is known for his discipline, his experience as a military commander, and his ability to navigate political minefields without exploding them entirely. Here's the quirky detail. Pertinax had actually tried to retire from politics not long before. He preferred a quiet life away from the constant grind of imperial politics. But fate, and the Praetorian Guard, clearly had other ideas. One might imagine him that morning, being told of his promotion, pausing just long enough to consider faking a sudden illness. The vote is swift, or rather, the appearance of a vote. In truth, The guard's support means the decision is already made. The senators raise their hands. Voices murmur agreement. And just like that, Rome has a new ruler. But politics is never that clean. In the corners of the chamber, small groups form, whispering about the suddenness of Commodus's death, about who was in the palace last night, about the danger of letting the guard play kingmaker. A few look toward Marcia's allies with barely concealed suspicion. She, wisely, does not appear here. Latus watches everything. He sees the nods of approval, the tightening of jaws, the quick scribbling of messages to be sent across the city. He knows this is only the first move in a much longer game. Outside the Curia, the forum begins to fill with citizens eager for gossip. The official story, that Commodus passed peacefully, spreads quickly. But so does another, darker rumor, that he was strangled by one of his own wrestling partners. Rome is a city built on rumor as much as stone. Both can last for centuries. As the Senate session ends, Pertinax is escorted toward the palace. His face is unreadable, but his posture is rigid, like a man stepping into a role he did not audition for. People cheer, some out of genuine respect, others simply because cheering is safer than staying silent. In a quieter moment, Eclectus leans toward Latus and says, "It's done." Latus, without looking away from the crowd, replies, "No, it's just begun. The city has a new emperor." Yes, but the ghost of Commodus still lingers in the marble halls, in the whispered conversations, and in the knowledge that those who can make an emperor can also unmake one. Somewhere, hidden in the folds of Rome's political theater, the next plot is already forming. The palace feels different now. The same marble corridors, the same towering statues of past emperors. But the air seems sharper, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. Servants scurry faster, their eyes lowered. Guards stand straighter, hands resting on the hilts of their swords with a little more awareness than usual. Pertinax walks those corridors for the first time as emperor. He is flanked by Latus and Eclectus, though the balance of power between the three is still uncertain. Pertinax is an experienced military man, but this palace has swallowed stronger rulers whole. When he reaches the imperial chambers, he does not step inside immediately. Instead, he pauses at the threshold, looking in at the opulent room where Commodus had slept, schemed, and, until less than 24 hours ago, ruled the empire. The bed has been stripped, fresh linens laid, the scent of incense hangs in the air, too heavy, as if trying to mask something less pleasant. There's an almost absurd detail here, one of Commodus's prized gladiator swords. Its hilt, inlaid with gold, leans casually against the wall near the writing desk. No one has dared move it yet. Historians still argue whether this was simply oversight or a subtle reminder left for Pertinax. Power in Rome is as much about performance as it is about policy. Latus breaks the silence with a blunt warning. "The guard put you here. The guard can take you out." Pertinax nods, not offended. He has been a soldier too long to mistake that for a threat. It's just a fact. That afternoon, the new emperor addresses the guard in the Castra Praetoria. He stands before rows of hardened soldiers, men who had served Commodus and others who had quietly despised him. Pertinax thanks them for their loyalty to Rome, not just to a man. He promises fair wages, discipline, and an end to wasteful extravagance. His tone is steady, almost austere. It is a good speech, the kind of thing senators will applaud. But here's the problem. The guard had grown accustomed to Commodus's generosity, which was often in the form of bribes disguised as gifts. Pertinax makes it clear there will be no such indulgences now. You can almost hear the collective mental note from the front row. "We'll remember that." Meanwhile, in the darker corners of the city, Marcia remains in quiet retreat. She is still alive, which is in itself remarkable given the number of times imperial mistresses have met untimely ends after a change in ruler. Some sources suggest Pertinax initially intended to exile her. Others believe she offered valuable information in exchange for her safety. The truth, as always, is buried under layers of rumor. In the Senate, there is cautious optimism. Pertinax is seen as a man who might restore dignity to the office, bring fiscal order, and maybe, just maybe, avoid unnecessary bloodshed. But this is Rome. Every reform is also a provocation. Here's the quirky part. Pertinax, ever the frugal administrator, orders an immediate audit of palace spending. This includes everything from military expenses to the amount of honey imported for the emperor's personal kitchen. Honey, the same sticky sweetness that Commodus had used liberally in his feasts, becomes an emblem of excess in the new reign. Latus, ever watchful, notices the shift in the guards' mood. They respect Pertinax, but respect in Rome is not loyalty. Loyalty is bought, and Pertinax is unwilling to pay the going price. One evening, as the sun dips behind the Palatine Hill, Pertinax stands alone in the gardens. He listens to the trickle of a marble fountain and breathes in the cool air. For a moment, it feels almost peaceful, but the rustle of footsteps in the shadows is a reminder that peace here is always temporary. Rome has a new emperor. Yes, but in the flicker of lamplight on polished armor, you can already see the next storm gathering. The storm arrives faster than anyone expects. Barely 3 months into Pertinax's reign, the air in Rome is thick with a kind of restless impatience. The guard mutters in taverns, in barracks, even in the shadowy colonnades of the Palatine. The whispers all sound the same. The donatives promised after Commodus's death have not been delivered, at least not in the size or speed they had hoped. One evening, a group of Praetorian soldiers confronts their tribunes. "We bled for the empire," one says, which is only partially true, since in Commodus's later years most of them did far more lounging than bleeding. "We put him in power. And now? He counts coins like a miser." The tone is not yet treasonous, but it's getting close enough to feel dangerous. Historians still argue whether Pertinax could have salvaged things with one grand gesture of generosity. Some suggest that had he dipped into the treasury for a lavish payment, the guard would have quieted, at least for a while. Others believe the discontent was inevitable. The guard had tasted the luxuries of Commodus's reign and would never settle for discipline and modest pay again. Pertinax, for his part, remains unmoved. He spends his mornings reviewing accounts, reducing expenditures, and, here's the quirky bit, personally inspecting the grain supply to ensure there's no price gouging in the markets. Imagine an emperor, cloak pulled close against the cold, quietly checking grain sacks like a stern shopkeeper. The common people appreciate it. The guard does not. Meanwhile, Latus and Eclectus begin to sense the shifting tide. Latus warns Pertinax to tread carefully with the soldiers, reminding him that the guard does not operate like a regular legion. These men are accustomed to privilege, and they guard emperors as much for the perks as for the principle. Tensions boil over in late March. A contingent of Praetorian soldiers, emboldened by the grumbling in their ranks, pushes into the imperial palace without warning. They are not yet a full mob, more like a spear point testing the armor. Pertinax meets them in the courtyard, flanked by only a handful of guards. He addresses them calmly, his voice carrying over the winter air. He speaks of Rome's dignity, of the guard's noble history, of the need for unity. For a moment, the confrontation eases. A few soldiers even lower their weapons. But others, those who've already decided Pertinax isn't their emperor, exchange glances and smirks. This is not over. That night, in the private quarters, Pertinax confides in Eclectus. They see generosity as strength, he says, and thrift as weakness. "I cannot buy loyalty with gold, not if it bankrupts Rome." Eclectus nods but says nothing. Even he knows that in this city, principles have a way of getting men killed. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, in the barracks of the Castra Praetoria, a more dangerous conversation begins. The guard has lived under Commodus's whims, seen emperors rise and fall, and they know exactly how to replace one ruler with another. All it takes is the right spark, and in the chill of the Roman night. Sparks are easy to find. The spark comes before dawn on a morning thick with mist, when the cobblestones of the Via Nomentana sweat with cold dew and the streets are still empty save for the occasional baker hauling bread. Inside the Castra Praetoria, the barracks are restless. Men shuffle in the dim torchlight, checking sword edges, buckling on armor not for a parade, but for something far more final. No one records who gives the order. Perhaps there was no single voice. Just a mutinous agreement reached after weeks of whispered plotting. But before the city stirs, a column of armed Praetorians is already on the move toward the Palatine Hill. The steady clink of their armor echoes through the streets. A grim drumbeat. Pertinax, roused by Eclectus, is not entirely surprised. He had sensed this day creeping toward him. What does surprise him is the speed. Historians still argue whether Latus, the prefect of the guard, turned a blind eye or simply could not control his men. The records hint both ways. But one thing is clear. The palace is about to be breached. Eclectus urges the emperor to flee. Pertinax refuses. If I run, he says, Rome will see an emperor who fears his own guard. If I stay, perhaps they will remember their honor. It's the kind of logic only emperors and gamblers use, betting that words can disarm blades. The Praetorians reach the palace gates, shouting for Pertinax to come out. Some demand money, others demand abdication. A few, perhaps drunk or simply reckless, shout threats loud enough to carry through the marble halls. In the peristyle, the sound is muffled but unmistakable, the rhythm of shields being struck in unison. Pertinax steps out into the courtyard. He is bareheaded, in a simple toga, the sort of image sculptors would later sanitize into marble dignity. But here, in the raw air of the morning, there is no gloss, just a man facing the iron teeth of his own guard. He speaks slowly, calmly. He reminds them of Rome's greatness, of their role as its defenders, of the fleeting nature of imperial power. It's an old trick. Make the audience think about the bigger picture. And they might forget their anger. And for a heartbeat, it works. The front ranks shuffle, some eyes drop, the grip on a few spears loosens. But then someone, perhaps a soldier emboldened by the crowd, perhaps just eager to see what happens, surges forward, shoving past his comrades. The momentum shifts instantly. Others follow. The ring of steel tightens. The shouts grow sharper. And now they are close enough for Pertinax to see the sweat on their brows. Latus is nowhere in sight. That absence will haunt the historical record, feeding debates for centuries. Was he complicit, cowardly, or simply trapped by events he couldn't stop? Eclectus moves to shield the emperor. But Pertinax raises a hand. No, let me speak to them. His voice carries even over the din. It is the last command he will give as emperor. The first sword rises. The courtyard seems to inhale. In the frozen second before history tips, there is only the scrape of metal, the faint hiss of breath, and the knowledge that this exact moment, is the one from which there is no return. The first blow is not a clean one. It lands awkwardly against Pertinax's shoulder, more a shove than a mortal strike, as if even the man wielding the blade isn't fully committed. But hesitation in a mob is a fragile thing. The moment the seal is broken, the rest follow with grim efficiency. The courtyard erupts into chaos, shouts, clashing steel, the desperate shuffle of sandals against marble. Eclectus throws himself between the emperor and the wall of Praetorians, catching a slash across his forearm. He's no soldier, but loyalty has its own kind of courage. He tries to drag Pertinax backward toward the inner chambers. But they don't make it more than a few steps before another spear thrust finds its mark. Pertinax staggers, his white toga blooming with crimson. Historians still argue whether he was struck 3 times or more than 20. Cassius Dio claims the emperor called out to them even as the blades struck. Appealing for reason, Herodian says he fell almost immediately. The life punched from him in one quick burst. Either way, the symbolism is the same. The man who sought to reform Rome is cut down by the very men sworn to defend it. There's no grand, cinematic silence afterward. The courtyard doesn't suddenly freeze like in some modern film. Instead, there's noise, boots scuffing, armor clanging, someone laughing too loudly, perhaps out of nerves. The men begin stripping Pertinax's body of rings, belt, and even his sandals. Roman politics is brutal, but Roman looting is thorough. Eclectus, wounded and pinned to the wall by 2 guards, can only watch as the corpse of his emperor is dragged a few feet away and left slumped like a discarded statue. The scent of iron hangs thick in the cool morning air, blood and weapon steel. Indistinguishable, in a matter of minutes. The Praetorians are gone, melting back toward their barracks as if returning from an early patrol. No speeches, no official pronouncement, no grand declaration of the deed, just the quiet understanding that the emperor is dead and the throne is empty. In the Senate, news spreads with the speed of scandal. Some senators feign outrage, others barely bother to hide their relief. The city's elite had grown wary of Pertinax's reforms, his attempts to restore discipline in the Praetorian Guard, to cut waste, to enforce moral standards. Few in power mourn him for long. Outside the palace, word trickles through the streets. Shopkeepers whisper it to customers. Bakers pass it over bread counters. The emperor is dead, they say. And in Rome, that's not a shock, it's an update. Ordinary Romans have seen emperors rise and fall like the changing of the seasons. The Praetorians, meanwhile, don't waste time. They know they've crossed the Rubicon in their own way. Killing an emperor is dangerous. But it also creates opportunity, and they plan to cash in on it. Rumors begin swirling that the Guard will auction off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. The idea sounds absurd, like selling the moon, but in the year 193 AD, absurdity is the most reliable political currency. That auction will become one of the most infamous episodes in Roman history, and the truest symbol of how far the empire has fallen from Augustus's careful choreography of power. But before the bidding begins, Rome takes one last look at the man who tried, briefly, to steady the ship. Pertinax is given a quiet, hurried burial. No grand triumphal arch will bear his name. His memory will not inspire armies. But in the cold, unflinching arithmetic of Roman politics, his reign will be remembered for its brevity, its sincerity, and the way it ended, with a ring of armored men in a marble courtyard. Deciding that reform was less profitable than rebellion, the palace returns to silence. But the echo of that morning will linger. It's not the sound of a sword cutting flesh, or a body hitting stone, it's the quieter, heavier sound of trust breaking. And in Rome, once that breaks, it rarely mends. By the time the sun dips below the rooftops, the Praetorian Guard has already set the stage for their next performance. The gates of their fortified barracks, the Castra Praetoria, are thrown open not for an invading army, but for Rome's elite. Senators, equestrians, and wealthy citizens shuffle in like bidders at some grotesque estate sale. The rules of this auction are simple and appalling. The throne of the Roman Empire will go to whoever offers the Praetorians the most money. Historians still argue whether this auction was premeditated or born from the chaotic aftermath of Pertinax's murder. Some suggest it was the Guard's way of making an example. Emperors are not appointed by the Senate, nor by the will of the people, but by the men with the swords. Two men quickly emerge as contenders. First is Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, Pertinax's own father-in-law and current city prefect. His bid is logical: keep the succession in the family, stabilize the city, and reward the Guard for their loyalty, if one can call it that. The second bidder is Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator and former provincial governor with a flair for opportunism. If political positions were a poker table, Julianus would be the man willing to push all his chips in on a bad hand just to see if the other player blinks. The scene is almost absurd. Inside the Praetorian camp, officers bark out numbers while messengers run between the bidders like couriers at an auction house. Julianus and Sulpicianus aren't in the same room. They shout their offers from different vantage points outside the camp, their voices straining to be heard over the clamor. Imagine an ancient version of bidding on eBay, except instead of a shipping fee, the winner must fund the loyalty of an entire armed guard. The sums climb quickly. Sulpicianus offers each soldier a substantial donative, enough to keep the average guardsman in wine and gambling for years. Julianus, unwilling to be outdone, counters with even more, 25,000 sesterces per man. He allegedly calls out. It's an astronomical figure, the kind of money that could build temples, pave roads, or, in this case, bribe several thousand professional killers. Herodian writes that the Guard's choice is pragmatic. Julianus is physically closer to the camp gates, making him the safer bet if negotiations go sour. Cassius Dio, less charitable, says the soldiers simply went to the highest bidder. No questions asked. Either way, the outcome is the same. The gates swing open for Didius Julianus, and the men who murdered one emperor cheer the arrival of the next. Julianus enters not like a conquering hero, but like a man walking into a very expensive trap. He's escorted to the Senate, where the Praetorian presence looms like an unspoken threat. The senators, perhaps eager to avoid Pertinax's fate, ratify the choice without serious protest. Official proclamations are made. The empire has a new ruler. In the streets, the reaction is less enthusiastic. Ordinary Romans are not impressed by an emperor bought and paid for in a public auction. Whispers spread that Julianus didn't earn the throne, he purchased it. The contrast with Pertinax, who at least tried to serve with integrity, is striking. Rome's moral decline isn't just visible, it's now officially priced. That night, Julianus celebrates in the palace that still smells faintly of Pertinax's blood. He raises a cup of wine, perhaps thinking himself clever for having outbid his rival. But here's the thing about buying loyalty, it expires. And in Rome, expiration dates come fast, far away. In the provinces, governors and generals receive the news with a mix of disbelief and calculation. Among them is Septimius Severus, commander of the legions in Pannonia. And unlike Julianus, Severus has something money can't buy: the disciplined loyalty of a frontier army, and an eagerness to march on Rome. Julianus has won the auction, but as the Praetorian Guard has just demonstrated, winning and surviving are not the same thing. The rumor reaches Septimius Severus like the faint echo of a distant drum, a whisper carried by couriers galloping along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Rome, the heart of the empire, has sold itself, not metaphorically, literally. The Praetorian Guard, the supposed protectors of the emperor, has auctioned the throne to the highest bidder. Severus, governor of Pannonia Superior, is not the sort of man to waste time on moral outrage. He's a soldier first, a politician second, and an opportunist always. Born in Leptis Magna, far from the marble heart of Rome, he has fought his way through the empire's ranks with a mix of discipline, calculation, and an unshakable belief that the empire is safest when commanded by a man who can win battles, not just buy them. Historians still argue whether Severus had long been eyeing the imperial purple or whether this news served as the spark to act. Cassius Dio suggests the latter, but admits that Severus was hardly the type to ignore an open door, especially when the man guarding it had no army of his own. His first step is the most dangerous, convincing his legions that marching on Rome is not treason, but justice. Standing before the hardened soldiers of the Danubian frontier, Severus paints a picture of a corrupted capital, defiled by greed, where an emperor has been purchased like a trinket in a marketplace. He doesn't need to embellish much. The men are already insulted that their years on the frontier mean less than a fat purse in the city. In a flourish both symbolic and strategic, Severus' troops proclaim him imperator on the spot. This is no Senate appointment, no polite handshake in a marble hall. It's the raw, gritty declaration of an army that has chosen its leader with sword calluses still fresh on their palms. From that moment, the march begins. The Danubian legions move like a steel tide, swallowing up miles of road each day. Civil war in Rome is rarely a matter of if but when. And Severus intends to make the when arrive quickly. Back in the capital, Didius Julianus receives word of Severus' advance. His reaction, perhaps understandably, is panic, wearing a thin mask of composure. He scrambles to prepare, issuing orders to the Praetorian Guard to defend the city. The irony is rich. The very men who sold him the throne are now his only line of defense. Unfortunately for Julianus, the Praetorians are parade soldiers, not hardened campaigners. Their last real battle might have been over the best seats in a tavern. Julianus attempts diplomacy. He sends envoys north, offering Severus titles, honors, and, of course, money. The offers are politely ignored. Severus isn't marching for a payout, he's marching for the purple. And unlike Julianus, he plans to keep it without owing a single coin to the Praetorian Guard. Meanwhile, the Senate watches events unfold with the same nervous energy as a gambler holding a bad hand. They remember how quickly the Guard turned on Pertinax, how easily Julianus bought his crown, and they quietly calculate whether they should shift their loyalties to the man with the marching army. The people of Rome, ever fond of spectacle, begin to take sides. Some admire Severus for being a soldier's soldier, a man from the provinces who might restore discipline to the empire. Others see him as just another strongman, ready to replace one corrupt regime with another. Severus sends a message ahead to the Praetorian Guard, promising them pardon if they surrender peacefully and hand over the men responsible for Pertinax's murder. It's a masterstroke, offering a way out that appeals to their survival instinct. The guard, realizing that Julianus cannot protect them from a battle-hardened army, begins to waver. Julianus still clings to hope. He stages public appearances, parades through the streets, tries to project strength, but it's difficult to look imposing when everyone knows the man outside the gates has 20,000 soldiers and you have an overpriced bodyguard with questionable loyalty. By the time Severus reaches the outskirts of the city, the decision is all but made. The guard refuses to fight. The Senate declares Julianus deposed, and the man who bought the empire with silver now stands alone, with nothing left to spend. Didius Julianus wakes to a Rome that has already moved on without him. The streets feel quieter, but not in a way that brings peace. More like the silence in an arena when the crowd knows the gladiator's fate before the sword even falls. The Senate convenes in emergency session. These men, so recently fawning over Julianus as imperator, now speak in cautious tones, the kind used when deciding how best to cut ties with a sinking ship. By mid-morning, the vote is unanimous. Julianus is no longer emperor. In his place, they proclaim Septimius Severus, still camped just beyond the city walls. Julianus doesn't hear the news from the Senate itself. He hears it from the Praetorian Guard, or rather, from the absence of them. The palace corridors, once thick with their gleaming armor, are conspicuously empty. The few who remain keep their eyes down, avoiding his gaze. It is, perhaps, the most honest answer they've ever given him. Historians still argue whether Julianus believed he could talk his way out of the situation or whether he simply couldn't comprehend how quickly power can dissolve. Cassius Dio claims Julianus asked, almost plaintively, "But what harm have I done?" A question that reveals either tragic innocence or willful blindness. By midday, the Senate sends a delegation, not to negotiate, but to deliver instructions. Julianus is ordered to leave the palace immediately. The euphemism for what follows is, to meet the executioner with dignity. The scene that plays out is strangely subdued. No mob storms the palace. No legion crashes through the gates. Instead, 2 soldiers, likely chosen for their reliability rather than their rank, escort Julianus to a small chamber. He is allowed a moment to compose himself. He drinks a cup of wine. Perhaps he thinks of his wife and daughter, or of the strange, brief weeks in which he held the most powerful title in the known world. The execution is swift. The blade falls without ceremony. No crowd watches. There's no appetite for public outrage over a man who had been more transaction than ruler. His body is quietly taken away. His name destined to join the long list of emperors whose reigns are measured not in years but in months. In Julianus's case, 66 days. Outside the walls, Severus receives the news with the calm satisfaction of a man who had planned for exactly this outcome. He enters the city not as a conqueror crushing resistance, but as a ruler walking into an already subdued Rome. His first order is to reform the Praetorian Guard, which, in Severus' vocabulary, means disbanding the existing force, sending them far from the capital, and replacing them with soldiers from his own legions. Loyalty, after all, is best guaranteed when it's been proven in battle, not bought at auction. In the forum, the people gather to watch Severus ride in. His armor is plain compared to the gilded finery some emperors have worn on such occasions. This is not a man interested in glittering appearances. His power rests in the disciplined ranks following him. Men who have marched hundreds of miles for the sole purpose of putting him on that marble throne. Whispers ripple through the crowd about the fate of those who murdered Pertinax. Severus wastes no time. The ringleaders among the Praetorians are hunted down and executed. It's swift justice, or calculated revenge, depending on who's telling the story. Either way, the message is unmistakable. The throne is no longer for sale. And those who treat it like a market stall will pay in blood. And somewhere in the shadows of the Palatine Hill, the memory of Commodus, his decadence, his vanity, his final gasp in a wrestler's chokehold, still lingers like the last note of a song no one dares sing aloud. Severus may rule now, but the empire has learned nothing about the fragility of its crown. Rome exhales, but it's not relief. It's the deep, uncertain breath taken between storms. Septimius Severus has secured the city, purged the palace, and removed every trace of the Praetorian treachery that made Commodus' death and Julianus's rise possible. But anyone listening closely can hear the gears of empire grinding toward the next war. The marble streets gleam again, scrubbed clean of blood and whispered bargains. Senators resume their carefully rehearsed performances of loyalty, wearing faces that suggest they had always supported Severus. Historians still argue whether this was genuine pragmatism or pure fear. But in Rome, the difference is academic. Survival has always been the city's favorite ideology. In the markets, storytellers are already shaping the narrative. Commodus, once whispered about as a mad tyrant, is now cast as a cautionary tale, the spoiled son of a good father who traded discipline for spectacle. Who let flattery replace competence? Who thought himself a god and ended as a footnote? His assassination, once a dangerous subject, becomes a parable about hubris, told in safe tones over cups of watered wine. Meanwhile, the shadow of Lucilla, Commodus' ambitious sister, executed years earlier for plotting against him, drifts like a ghost through these new retellings. In a strange way, her failed conspiracy now feels like the first act of the tragedy that ended in the auction of an empire. Severus does not speak her name, but he doesn't have to. Everyone knows the line between palace intrigue and open revolt is thin. And everyone remembers where Commodus' line first began to fray. Severus' reign begins not with celebration but with a quiet tightening of the reins. His reforms reshape the guard into his personal instrument, loyal only to him. His rivals in other provinces are not forgotten. His eyes are already turning toward the east, where Pescennius Niger waits with an army of his own. Rome may think it has found stability, but the empire is about to learn that Severus' ambitions stretch far beyond its walls. As for the memory of Commodus last night, the private banquet, the poisoned wine, the unexpected resilience, and finally the wrestler's strangling grip, it fades into a kind of forbidden legend. The palace does not keep records of such things. Servants who survived tell their stories in half voices, always glancing over their shoulders. There are no monuments, no inscriptions, only the occasional slip of the tongue from someone old enough to remember the sound of the emperor's chair scraping back from the table just before the end. Quirky details survive in odd corners, a marble bust with the nose chipped off, said to have been thrown by Commodus in a rage, a ring bearing the crest of the wrestler who ended his life, quietly sold in a back alley decades later, a faded fresco in a suburban villa depicting Hercules in a headlock. They are fragments, impossible to prove, but enough to keep the story alive for those who like their history spiced with rumor. And then, of course, there's the part no historian can agree on: whether Commodus' assassination was the salvation of Rome or the beginning of its next great unraveling. Severus would claim the former. Dio, ever the cynic, might suggest the latter. The truth is likely somewhere in between, a hinge moment in history where one man's death simply cleared the stage for the next act in an endless performance. Rome has always been good at continuing the show. The pacing slows now. The clamor of the forum fades into a low, distant murmur, like the sea pressing against unseen cliffs. The marble glints softer in the waning light, the colors of Rome bleeding into gentle shades of gold and gray. Torches are being lit one by one, each a small, flickering promise that the darkness will not swallow the city entirely, at least not tonight. Somewhere, in a quiet corner of the Palatine, the empty banquet hall still stands. The table has been cleared, the floor swept, the air perfumed with fresh laurel to erase the memory of that final night. But stone remembers. It holds onto the echo of Commodus' laughter, the scrape of the chair, the faint rattle of a poisoned cup set down a little too hard. The empire moves forward because it must. Senators debate, merchants haggle, children run barefoot in the dusty side streets, chasing hoops and shouts, and yet, somewhere deep inside the heart of the city, there's a shared knowledge that nothing is truly safe here, not crowns, not power, not even life itself. If history whispers anything from Commodus' fall, it's that empires are living things. And living things do not die from one wound. They weaken slowly, imperceptibly, until one day they cannot rise again. Perhaps this was just another cut. Or perhaps it was the moment Rome began to lean, ever so slightly, toward its long decline. But for tonight, the streets are quiet. The wine is poured. The moon rides high above the Tiber, casting silver trails across its restless surface. Somewhere, A storyteller lowers his voice, leans in, and begins again. There was once an emperor who thought himself a god.